Go for Leadership, the podcast with Daniel and Gert.
Hello and welcome for today's Go for Leadership podcast. My guest today is Dan Norenberg.
Go for Leadership interviews.
Dan, welcome to the show.
Daniel, it's a pleasure to join you today. I'm really looking forward to our exchange.
Awesome. Dan, like always, we ask our guests to introduce themselves within 30 seconds. So Dan, show is yours.
I'll do my best. You can probably hear from my accent that I'm from North America. I grew up and studied in the Midwest. I have a background in psychology. I spent 10 years in California working with two high-tech companies. They were both very high growth, which meant I got exposed to leadership and management at a pretty early age, perhaps too early. And when that last company went out of business, I probably would have stayed there forever, but I decided to grab a backpack and head to Europe, and came to Europe for a couple of weeks, which really struck me. And long story short, since I had no real obligations in California, I decided to stay a little bit longer, and that 2 weeks has now been nearly 30 years. So I bumped into a few people from an organization called the Siemens AG, and sooner than later, I had joined their executive development group and spent 4 years with Siemens, working with them in leadership and team building exercises in Germany, in the UK, and also in France. And Siemens really sets a gold standard for education and learning, and it was a great laboratory for me, and they gave me some great opportunities. And then I later started my own learning and development company, which focused on leadership, team building, and communication skills, called Envision Learning. And I ran that for about 25 years. And during that time, we worked with about 25,000 professionals in 26 different countries, including 76 nationalities. So I've had quite a wonderful run here on my 2-week holiday in Europe.
I love that. So you have been in the heart, let's say, of leadership, let's say, or let's say surrounded by many leaders. So I would say very well what leaders do and what leaders don't do. Maybe you can give us a glimpse. What is your definition of good leadership?
Well, that's a great question, one that's often asked many times. And let me say that, I think there's this question about whether leaders are born or whether they're made. And I think it's both. I think that we can all learn to be better leaders. And fundamentally, I think the key to leadership is to, help other people be successful. And let me just unpack that just a bit, because we need to understand what success means. Success for me is the intersection between achievement and fulfillment. So, we probably all know people who have, achieved a lot, but never felt fulfilled. And you need that balance. And I think a leader, he or she, helps people to really, achieve beyond their boundaries, to do more than they think they could, but also to find peace and satisfaction with what they do. I think there's an element of that, and that starts with the leader. If a leader, if she shows that she's both achievement oriented and fulfilled in what she does, then other people want to model that. So that's what I would say.
I think that's a great kind of definition. You just mentioned maybe you probably have been too early in a leadership position, and how would you define the right moment for somebody to step into a leadership position? Or what is, in your aspect, very important or key, essential to have ready, let's say, before going into the first leadership position?
Yeah, and I don't know, that's a great question. I don't know if any of us are ever ready for that, but often people that move into leadership are those people that, number one, they fit into the culture that they're working in. They manage what is asked of them and perhaps a little bit more, and they show an appetite to want to do more. And that's what usually pushes someone into leadership. I said for me personally, and maybe it's because I'm a real student of leadership, I help others to improve their leadership performance, that I can look back maybe with a certain degree of reflection to my past. I think in my early leadership days, I was extremely, let's say, results driven. And that was the primary focus of my leadership, let's say, agenda, and perhaps overlooked certain people sensitivities. Mm-hmm. So I think the most important thing for someone stepping into a leadership role today, I would say, is to be yourself be authentic, be able to show that you're vulnerable. Don't expect to have all the answers that yourself. I think this has been a big change of what we expect of leaders today as to what we expected of them, let's say 10, 20, or even 30 years ago.
I think you just mentioned a very important topic as well, as that we as leaders are just human beings, right? So vulnerability is, of course, something that is with us. In your book, you outlined that a little more deeper. Maybe you can give us a glimpse on how or to which extent vulnerability is important for leaders.
Yeah, well, I think it's everything, because the vulnerability is connected very closely with authenticity. And we know that being authentic is the core thing. If you're not being authentic as a leader, then people don't really know how to react to you, because they're always playing against a model or a mask. And it's really been something that I've seen time and time again, across cultures, across different businesses, across different sizes of companies. Those leaders that could express vulnerability, which is not a weakness or it's not incompetence, but just to be honest, was really important. And I even opened my book with a story about vulnerability that I learned at a very, very young age, which was quite profound for me. And it really, it's stayed with me even to this day.
Mm-hmm. Something that I think we discussed in the introduction, that taking ownership as well for leaders is very essential. So once you take, let's say, your first leadership role or position, besides, let's say, that maybe you are not really or can be really prepared of, but to really go for the next step and have that really wish and also the way of getting, let's say, to that position. How do you see that ask or topic of taking really ownership of something and showing pride of executing?
Well, it's a good question. Let me unpack that in a way. I mean, first of all, my work is primarily with either the executive team in an organization or strategic teams. Those could be sort of the functional heads or supply chain management or manufacturing or something like that. But let me share what this ownership means. And this is where this ownership concept comes into the book. And people say, what is ownership? And let me just say a little bit about that. Let's just imagine that you're a team lead. And obviously your first responsibility is to, support your team and to make sure that team, that you own the objectives that you're responsible for. Yet we see in today's business climate, with the degree of complexity, the speed of change, and the diverse workplace that's out there, is that ownership for me is beyond our functional responsibility. So if I'm a team lead, what I also want to be doing is really being proactive and seeking out other team leads who are at my level and saying, hey, how well is our team supporting you to be successful? And vice versa. How well are you supporting me? And when we start to collaborate, beyond our own functional basis, this, getting out of this so-called silo thinking, if you will, we begin to transform what leadership and what ownership is all about. And we start to own up to a higher purpose than just our team function. And what that means in an executive team or in a very strategic team, my experience is that you have a CEO and her team, all very competent people running a function. And often people will say, gosh, I wish they just let me do my job. Maybe they had a manufacturing. I'll say, what's that? I was like, well, just let me run my function. And what I try to remind these people in a senior leadership team is that they have a foot in their function and in that team, but they also have a foot in the executive team, if you will. And that's what I call managing the dilemma. And if you're really, really stepping up to ownership, what this means is sometimes I might have to take a decision that's maybe not so good for my supply chain group, but I know it's good for the overall business. And this is sort of a transformation that's taking place across the business. So that's sort of a broader scope of ownership as I see it.
And I fully support your view, and I like that in particular, because my experience in particular to large corporations is that there's always this dilemma of contradicting targets or like you said, silo thinking. So how do you break that walls and really ask, let's say, people to take ownership for the whole company, and even not only for the company, for the whole, let's say, the borders are endless at the end, but how you take, let's say, the ownership for the whole company?
Well, I think it's a great question. I think it starts with just, transparency and getting out on the table where people's interests are and looking about how are we measured and, what are we evaluated for and how can we be successful? And on some degree, we need to fight for our function. I mean, this is clear. I mean, the team leader or a functional leader needs to defend, his or her people and the purpose of their business. But today, if we're really going to be successful, we only do that by maximizing achieving strategic targets. And strategic targets can only be accomplished by, let's say, the combination of different functions working together to serve a higher business purpose. And that's why I talk quite extensively in my book about making sure that the customer is at the center of everything that you do, because that's also a type of currency, if you will. It's a type of engagement currency that whether you're a software developer, whether you're in customer care, whether you're in sales, I've rarely met people that didn't really want to serve the customer. But when we're simply talking about our functional targets and priorities, they're often conflicting. But if we can keep that customer at the center of the conversation in the executive team, in the strategic meetings, then we're going to have a lot higher opportunity of reaching a higher level of engagement and ownership.
So you have engaged with many, many different professionals and have supported them in the development path. So to which extent do you think those people have been able to foster that level of, let's say, I bring it into the play with the magic cycles of Simon Sinek, right? Starting with why. And by answering this question, you encounter often, well, what is my implication to the whole game towards the customer? So what kept those executives awake at night, and how could you have, let's say, supported them in developing into them into the right path?
Yeah, fair enough. I think that, we talked a little bit earlier about how change has really changed, if you will, how the speed of business is moving much faster. And in my work with leaders, one of the single most important things I encourage them to do is to really invest heavily in developing a strong and effective leadership team. Because I think what happens is you begin to move through the leadership ranks, people are used to, let me say, using their executive muscle to get things done. They have their few go-to people and they can get things done. But the higher and the more successful or the more advanced that you grow in an organization, the fewer things that you can do and the fewer that you know about the absolute details of what's going on. So I encourage senior leaders to continue to double down, maybe resist the temptation to do things themselves and to really build strong teams that can really stand on their own.
And I think one aspect you also covered in the book that I very like is let's say, how meetings matter, let's say this way, and how good meetings, let's say, are required for those leaders to really bring that, let's say, attitude and that thrive to the different teams. Maybe you can also outline that a little bit.
Well, meetings are a fundamental aspect of business excellence. And I have quite a long background in sports. I played a lot of sports when I was growing up, both in high school and university. And no matter how good you become, you always go back every season and work on the fundamentals. And I think often we take things like meetings for granted. It's things that we have to do. They're just a part of maybe we might say Alltag, or everyday business, if you will. But what happens in a meeting is what happens in the business. And I can sit in on a leadership meeting for an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours, and probably 30% of my consulting advising time is spent just watching meetings and then giving feedback. But you can tell a lot about what's happening in an organization by the way leadership meetings are run. Do they start on time? Is there a good constructive challenge? Do they track their decisions? Is there a good collaborative climate where people are building on ideas, or do you feel like it's a group of Roman gladiators who are eating at each other? So a meeting culture is really everything to the success of a business. And sometimes when I approach an executive and say, well, I'd be more than happy to sit on your meetings and perhaps make some observation, they say, well, Dan, that's what we do at the entry level. And then maybe after some discussion, they invite me to sit in the meeting, and they do see that they can learn some things about how they run their meetings. And the benefit is they can multiply that and replicate that in all the other meetings in the company. So I think it's a tremendous performance booster.
Do you think that meeting culture has, let's say, evolved, or let's say changed throughout the different decades?
Well, I think so, because if we look back to the past, I mean, and this is really the essence of my book, is that leadership in the past was really about the heroic individual. You know, even today, and you know, there are a lot of good books out there on let's say leader development. You know, there's servant leadership, there's heroic leadership, there are leadership models just by the hundreds. But the organization of the past was really based on a model where the leader was an individual endeavor, and we sort of rallied behind that heroic leader, that man or woman that sort of had the answers, if you will, and then everybody followed to execute. But the speed of change today, the complexity and the diversity of the workforce is calling on a new type of leadership. So I really believe we're at a crossroads. And I believe that let me just say, while I believe that individual leader development is important, the future of leadership is leadership teams. And this is not a bottom-up process, this is a top-down process. It's leadership teams that are really going to guide companies to their future success. And here's why. We have individual leaders where we make a lot of investment. And here we can help people improve their, let's say, leadership performance. But what we know is that there is no individual contribution, no matter from any part of the business, that leads directly into an organizational result without going through a leadership team. So that's why it's important that we begin to put more emphasis on leadership teams as, let's say, the unit of analysis. We spent, and I'll be a little bit provocative here, we spent far too much time coaching the players where we should be coaching teams. That's what's really going to move us to transformational growth. The early adapters to leadership team development as a team construct is the next big thing in organizational development.
Do you think it's, I like that idea in particular because teams are, let's say, the smallest unit, so to say, of an organization. In particular, now the differences between maybe smaller and larger corporations. Do you think that in that particular times of meeting culture and how you interact in between, also maybe now being influenced with COVID, do you think that there's a lot to be improved in terms of meeting culture?
I think it's something that we have to have under constant review. I mean, I'm in certain situations where I see really, really good meetings. You know, I see leaders and teams that really balance, let's say, a results orientation to their meeting with a collaborative climate, you know, or they maybe even have observers, maybe after working with me for a while, how to sort of coach their own meetings so they can improve. But is there opportunity for improvement? Yes, I believe significant. Of course, now we've gone primarily to a virtual platform, which has led us perhaps more to a little more results orientation and dealing with the tactical operational aspects of the business. And I know that many of my clients are, looking forward to the time when we can come back and do more face-to-face stuff where there's more of a intimate touch with the people.
Do you think in that virtual world, it has become much more, let's say, opportune to set up meetings because it's not that, let's say, the barrier is not that high? Because I encounter that at this stage, it's if you go for a physical meeting, right, you have to prepare, you have costs in terms of travel. So you prepare an agenda, you prepare already an objective that you want to achieve in the meeting. You set up the meeting to put the right people in, the decision makers. So there's a lot of more procedures in front and behind the meeting itself. And I see these days that with setting up a Teams, a Zoom or Cisco WebEx meeting, it's so easy. It's 2 clicks away, and it's so fast to put 20, 30, 40 people into that meeting. So do you also have encountered that kind of let's say, issues?
Well, yes, and I think you're right. It's the Zoom culture of meetings or Teams or whatever it is. It's a little bit like being able to eat anything you want and not gain weight. You just keep pouring it on, and being able to move click to click in different meetings in different regions of the world, really leads to overload. It leads to poor meeting quality. lower results, employee burnout. So I think that those things that you mentioned earlier about, does the meeting have a clear focus? Is there an agenda? Making sure that meetings don't end on the hour. We should never end a meeting on the hour, because if you end one meeting on the hour and the next meeting starts in the hour, you either got to leave one meeting early or you're going to be late to the next meeting. So you've already broken the promised culture, which is really important for a high performance culture. So I think that these things that you mentioned that I talk about in my book also need to be implied and put into place as it results to virtual meetings as well.
Now, I think it's in particular a challenge if you are leading a team of leaders, right? So what advice would you give a leader for the right composition of a team, of a high performance team?
What do you mean by composition?
So what members you would let's say, suggest, skills or whatever?
Fair question. I mean, the reality of your question is, Daniel, the reality is most senior leaders, most CEOs even, don't get to choose their team. Mm-hmm. And this is the mark of a good leader. The mark of a good leader is when I come in most cases, I'm going to inherit a team. Mm-hmm. And so the question becomes, how do I make the most out of this team? So I think that's first about, so if I'm in, and that's one of the areas that I do a lot of work. So let's say a new leader takes over a new team, or a new leader comes in, takes over a new team in a new organization. And I'm often asked to help accelerate that process, like a type of insurance policy. And of course, the steps that a leader wants to take in that situation, and this is maybe a little bit different answer to your question, but it's about how can I very quickly make a connection with those people so I understand what their strengths are, what their areas of development are. How well can I understand the situation of this business? Number two. Number three, can I drive a very strong expectation exchange so that I can share the expectations that I have of the individual members and the collective members of the team? And can they also share what they expect of me? And last but not least, can I be clear about my executive agenda, or my leadership agenda, if you will? What are the key things that I want to see happen? And there, as a senior leader, I want to focus on what I want to accomplish, but not get too much into the how, because that should be more about the team. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of the process that you're going through. And of course, then a follow-up question is then, what happens if somebody doesn't fit in? And then you've got to make some tough choices about that. Either the person has to change, you've got to change the person, or change the person. But what I always remind senior leaders when they take over a new team and they perhaps express that, well, maybe I need to change this team out, I always remind them that if you look at any championship team, whether it's soccer, football, cricket, basketball, or anything, the teams that win championships don't win with all A players. They've got A players, they've got B players, and they've got C players. So the role of a leader is, how do I make the most out of the players that I have in this team? And that's what I would say on that issue.
I think the points you mentioned, it's I think a very essential path to start, let's say, like you said, right, starting a new encounter with a leadership team. What skills, and I think one of the questions I have is, I think communication is an essence skill set that is required. So active communication for leaders. Do you would say there are other skills required these days for senior leaders?
Well, let's stay with active communication, because I think we can unpack that a little bit, what that really means. And I put a lot of focus on that in my book, and because it's really one of the first signature strengths of a highly effective leadership team. And that is to develop the ability to develop and maintain resilient relationships. And that perhaps is a part of what you might refer to as active communication. And resilient relationships are so absolutely critical, because this means that I have the ability to share what I really think, often unfiltered in a leadership team, to be able to share, where I'm struggling, what I'm thinking, or maybe to challenge another member of the leadership team. This always shouldn't be related to the CEO to be criticizing or challenging some other part of the business. And having a resilient relationships means I can make that challenge, I can push someone, I can challenge someone, and people can take that and sort of bounce back with that. So that helps us uncover problems, think creatively, and really have a good challenge in strategic reviews and things of that nature. So I think that we shouldn't just skip over that. That's really, really fundamental. What's the quality of the conversation? What's the quality of resilience in the relationships? And sometimes when I'm talking to a leadership team, they might say, well, we don't really have any disagreements. We don't really have any conflicts. And then, of course, my yellow flag goes up. And it's what I call the country club mentality, that either they're not being honest with each other, they're not really sharing, or something else is going on there. And that, we know statistically, factually, that 60% of executives feel that trust is an issue in their team, in the executive team. So perhaps not willing to step up and share what their challenge is, or to challenge somebody because they feel if they challenge somebody in one part of the business, that person might come back and challenge them, and that might make their life a bit difficult. And I say that's what makes a great team.
And I think that's also an issue, and I think that's also a little bit the reason why I started the podcast, right? So for me, trust is the kit between human beings, and I think trust is the essence as well of, let's say, high performance teams. So how do you bring those, let's say, level of trust back to those, let's say, problem childs that you have encountered?
Yeah. Well, I think that this trust issue, and I refer to this, I call it Titanic challenges, which is really about looking at those issues that are under the iceberg. These the white elephants, the unwritten rules, the hidden agendas, and it's about, number one, making sure there's a safe environment, and having a senior leader that's willing to hold that space and that conversation with someone like me in the room. And then, it's the preparation work and talking to people in confidence about where they see the challenges, how they feel they're being perceived, what's really working in the leadership team, what's not working, and then consolidating that and bringing that into the team, let's say initially on an anonymous basis, to where it's suddenly on the table, if you will. And we take a look at how those trust issues impact the performance of the organization and how it also impacts the performance culture. So it's rarely one person. There's rarely one problem child. And if that's the issue, if you will, then I would probably handle that in a different setting, in a one-on-one coaching. But what I usually see with trust issues is it's usually a systematic process across the team.
I mean, the danger with that is, of course, that, like you mentioned, that the trust issue also is being encountered in many individual situations, right? So if I don't trust you, maybe in a work environment, I maybe don't send you all the details that is required in order to perform your job. So I think it's as essential, like you said, to resolve that by all means.
Absolutely. And I think a leadership team is a good place to have that conversation. And that's where trust begins in the organization. That's the code for performance. So it isn't about being best friends, and it isn't about telling everybody everything, but it is about developing a respectful relationship where we can disclose really our perceptions and what we're thinking. And that's where I find the German word for this perception so powerful, Wahrnehmung. It's such a gripping word because wahr means truth and nehmen means take. So it's the truth I take from a situation. And what we know is that in any given situation, someone might perceive it one way and somebody might perceive it another way. But when we can exchange those perceptions, we can begin to build a sort of a common understanding. And we see that often in multicultural teams, for example, where people take different things away from the same experience.
I like that. And I think that's also the challenge, of course, working in different cultural environments, also all different backgrounds of the people that kind of collaborate together. One question I still have is when we look into the development, let's say, of our next generation leaders, do you think that we prepare them for the challenges that lies ahead of them, let's say?
Well, that's a great question, because we're seeing more and more, let's say, younger leaders, younger talents move into leadership because of maybe their technology expertise. I mean, look at the heads of, digital business groups now. I mean, my goodness, they're compared to somebody who's running supply chain or manufacturing, something like that. So we're seeing a real transformation. And I think that it's changing because in the past, we developed leaders by largely, guiding and feeding them with content about leadership and models and, learning content. And that's not the case anymore. So most of the younger leaders that I work with, they know more about a particular topic than I do because we have something called the internet. And so the content knowledge of these young leaders is much higher than leaders of the past. But that's also a little bit dangerous because a young leader that may feel they may have read more books about leadership than I have, but knowing something isn't doing something. I would say that's where my role as a leader has changed significantly, where maybe 20 years ago, I was perhaps the carrier of content, into a group. And then we'd work with that content to help that team or leader become more effective in a coaching situation. And today, content is a given. There's so much out there. But my role now is more about being a curator, helping curate information that's really, valuable for this particular person or team at that point in time, and then helping them use that. So I think there's this distance between knowing something and doing something is absolutely critical for the newer leaders that are coming up. Oftentimes there's a misperception of things. I've seen that, I've read that, I did a paper on that, I know that. Well, that's not doing it. Mm-hmm. And this distance between knowing something and doing something is really this distance of starting it, continuing it, and then doing it long enough to get some feedback on it.
I love it, Dan. And maybe also, like I usually ask the question, when you started your career, what have been your advice to the younger yourself?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's a great question. I'd say there are 3 points I'd say to the younger Dan, and I can see him back in California starting in that first job down in Newport Beach with a company car, very proud, very excited, very ambitious. And I'd say number 1, I tell that younger Dan, don't be so hard on yourself. Don't push so hard for success. It will come. That would be number 1. So don't be so hard on yourself. Always trying to, this idea in a younger Dan, trying to be perfect. It's not about perfection, it's about progress. And second thing I would say is that comparisons aren't really helpful. Each of us as human beings are very, very unique. And if you compare yourself to another human being, you're either going to feel you're less than that person, or you're probably going to think that you're more than that person. And that's not a good place to be. That'd be the second. But the third thing I would say to that younger Dan, I'd say, continue as you are. Here I am now, a long way away from that early Dan. I'm living in Europe. I've got a wonderful family. I do work that I think is very, very meaningful. And I've always followed my heart. So I've made choices that may have seemed difficult in the moment, but they've always turned out to be the good thing for me. I didn't do what was expected. I do what I felt was in my heart. And so I would put my hand on that young Dan and say, Dan, just follow your heart and everything will work out fine.
Go for Leadership, the podcast with Daniel and Gert.
I think that's an awesome final statement. Follow your heart. Thank you so much, Dan, for being our guest today.
A pleasure. Thanks for the questions and enjoyed engaging with you, Daniel.
Go for Leadership,